Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine starting your day, maybe grabbing some tea, quiet ritual, right? But instead of checking the weather, you're digging through global research journals. And what you find month after month, it's this echo, this same message coming from places like Sudan, Iran, Moldova. The theme, always, autism as disorder, autism as deficit, risk, pathology, impairment.
Hmm.
And here's where it gets really interesting for you listening in.
Yeah.
This isn't just dusty academic stuff. It actually ripples out. It affects policy, therapy, the actual day-to-day lives of autistic people everywhere. So today, we're diving deep into this really fascinating, really vital question. Who truly gets to define autism? What sources are we looking at, and what's our mission here?
Well, what's insightful, I think, is just the sheer weight of other people's definitions. For, nearly 100 years now, the story of autism hasn't really been told by autistic people. It's been shaped by observers, diagnosticians, managers, you could say. Think about the big manuals, the DSM, the ICD.
Right, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual and the International Classification of Diseases. Standard stuff.
Exactly. And researchers, names like Kanner, Simon Baron-Cohen, the source material suggests they've all been weaving this net, this understanding that frames autism in terms of deficit. What's missing? So the papers we're looking at today, like Nasir from Sudan, Zelenko from Moldova, Oruji from Iran, what's striking isn't that they're saying something brand new.
It's the sameness.
It's the sameness, this global agreement on the deficit view. Now, if you don't know the field, that consensus looks like truth, right? Solid evidence. But for many autistic people, our source material highlights this reads like erasure, like their own experience is just being written over again and again across the globe.
Wow. Erasure rehearsed across continents. That's a strong phrase.
It is, and it brings up this fundamental question. If you don't get to define yourself, well, then you risk just becoming whoever somebody else says you are. So yeah, our mission today is to explore that, this idea of narrative sovereignty, the necessity, really, to define ourselves.
Okay, so we're definitely talking about a global phenomenon. It's not just one lab's opinion. These deficit scripts, as you call them, what exactly are they? What gets lost? What's erased when autism is framed only that way?
They're essentially these recurring stories, these narratives that always look at autism through a lens of what's supposedly lacking or broken or abnormal. They end up defining people by what they can't do or what they don't do in the expected way, rather than recognizing who they are, how they experience the world, or, their strengths.
And you mentioned GLP voices being erased, gestalt language processing.
Precisely. That's a critical piece that gets overlooked. GLP, for listeners who might not know, it's a different way of acquiring and using language. Instead of building with single word bricks, Gestalt processors often learn and use language in whole chunks, phrases, sentences, even intonation patterns that carry a whole meaning or feeling.
Like grabbing a whole movie line to express something complex.
Exactly like that. Meaning is held whole, it's embodied, but when that way of communicating isn't recognized, isn't valued, well, you get this pervasive narrative. The narrative that, as the source contends, basically says autistic individuals are just disordered or deficient, not simply different, just wrong.
That's a huge difference. It connects directly to education, doesn't it? I'm thinking of that Dr. Clark quote the source uses. Education is power. Train the student to be a proper handler of power. But the source argues that for many autistic people, especially Gestalt processors, school felt like the opposite of empowerment.
Yeah, that's a stark reality highlighted in the material. For many who grew up autistic, education wasn't about building agency. Not really. Think about things like ABA drills, applied behavior analysis, focusing on changing behaviors, or social skills training, constantly being told, make eye contact. The source argues these were often about compliance, getting people to fit in. An apprenticeship in domestication is the phrase used, not empowerment.
Domestication?
Yeah.
Wow.
Even literacy instruction, which should be freeing, right? It was often measured against neurotypical standards that didn't fit autistic ways of knowing. So things like scripting, using learned phrases, echolalia, repeating words, weaving these gestalts together, that was often seen as just delay or disorder.
Instead of valid meaning-making.
Instead of valid communication, yeah.
So the very systems meant to help were actually disempowering. It makes sense then why the author of our source material felt they had to write their own books, like No Place for Autism, Holistic Language Instruction, responding to that erasure.
Absolutely. The source positions those books as exactly that, an attempt to reclaim education, to make it power wielded by autistic people, not just on them. Holistic language instruction, for instance. It pushes back hard against what the author calls the phonics-only tunnel vision of some reading approaches.
The science of reading mob.
That's the term used, yeah. arguing that narrow focus can erase autistic joy and, crucially, GLP ways of using language, of scripting worlds, and then decolonizing language education. That book broadens the lens even further. It looks at the sort of colonial baggage of language education itself.
That's fascinating. So it's not just how we teach reading, but which languages get valued at all. The source says English can become like a foreign land in schools, while home languages, Spanish, Tagalog, Arabic, Mixteco, whatever, get pushed aside.
You've hit on a really crucial point there. What gets called ELD, English language development, often functions, the source argues, in a deeply colonial way. It's more about assimilation into the dominant language, not really supporting the child's whole linguistic identity.
Right.
There's often little support for developing deep literacy in the home language. And the message, sometimes subtle, sometimes not, is basically, your language doesn't belong here.
And that applies globally.
Seems so, yeah. The source brings up the white boy autism meme, how that's insidious because autistic kids are everywhere. Khartoum, Tehran, Chisinau, they show up in schools just as autistic, but often facing that same erasure, not just of their language, but their epistemology, their way of knowing.
The epistemology, their whole way of understanding the world.
Exactly. So a truly liberatory education, the source argues, it would have to start by centering autistic and GLP ways of knowing and value those home languages as foundations, not problems to fix.
Okay, this whole thread about language, power, whose knowledge counts, it leads us straight into something really fundamental. Safety. It's something many might take for granted, but what a privilege it must be to feel genuinely safe today. What does safety, or the lack of it, mean in this context for autistic people, especially GLPs, according to the source?
Well, it's a stark point the source makes. Safety often isn't the default assumption for autistic people, particularly the gestalt processors. Their communication gets mistranslated, right? Their intentions doubted, pathologized. Their own stories get retold by others, often in hostile ways.
Even the research can be unsafe.
That's the argument. Look at those papers again. The Iranian paper suggesting herbal remedies to make people less autistic. The implication is that difference needs fixing, erasing. The Moldovan paper repeating Kanner's old idea about an inherent inability to form relationships, completely ignoring GLP ways of connecting. The Sudanese survey reinforcing male predominance, making autistic girls and women invisible. The source argues this isn't just a lack of safety, it's almost an impossibility of safety when your very being is questioned at the level of scholarship.
So narrative sovereignty, defining yourself, it's not just intellectual. The source connects it directly to basic safety. The right to exist.
Precisely. That's the core argument. Being able to define ourselves, to speak in our own voices, resist erasure that's presented as the only path to creating the safety others might assume is just there. Until then, every new study, every diagnostic update can feel like another reminder of how precarious it is to be autistic in a world that, the source contends, still questions if you deserve to exist as you are.
And talking about influential narratives, this brings us to a name the source highlights specifically, Jaime Baron-Cohen. Why does his influence loom so large, and what does the source see as the consequences of his framing, particularly for GLPs?
Yeah, the source positions him as a kind of paradigmatic authority, not necessarily saying his insights are uniquely brilliant, but that his sheer volume of work has saturated the field. We're talking over 700 papers, concepts like empathizing, systemizing scales, prenatal hormone stuff, theory of mind experiments.
Right, trying to measure empathy versus system thinking, or linking autism to hormones, or testing the ability to understand others' thoughts.
Exactly. And the source argues that in academia, where citations are currency, that sheer volume, that frequency starts to look like truth. It becomes unavoidable.
So even in very different places, Tehran, Chisinau, Khartoum, his way of thinking becomes the default. How does the source say that impacts understanding autism, especially for GLPs?
The source uses strong language here. It calls this influence not neutral, even arguing it functions as a form of violence.
Wow.
Yeah. The argument is that Baron-Cohen effectively gets to define what autism is, what communication is, even what counts as legitimate knowledge. And critically, the source points out, he's apparently never written about gestalt language processing, never acknowledged echolalia as maybe having authorial intent, or scripts as a form of memory.
But his voice dominates.
It dominates, the source suggests. Amplified by citations, it drowns out the lived experience. So GLPs, they're just absent from his framework, and thus absent from tons of research citing him. So Kids who sound like their mothers, that GLP trait, get framed as failures in communication. Girls who mask or script become invisible. The fidelity, the meaning within gestalt language gets twisted into a deficit of social drive in his models.
So that 1994 accent study wasn't an isolated thing.
The source frames it as a template that continues to reframe difference as disorder, amplifying that deficit script because it's just been amplified so much for so long it's hard to challenge.
That's a really powerful critique. It feels like this is bigger than just one researcher, though, or even the DSM. Is there a sort of deeper, older pattern the source material connects this to?
Absolutely, yeah. Beneath all this, the source suggests there's a much older pattern, older than psychology itself. It points to a long history in Western thought of defining things by opposition. Good versus evil, order versus chaos, male versus female, civilized versus savage.
Binary thinking.
Exactly. A grammar of binaries, as the source calls it. Rooted in patriarchy, maybe sanctified in some religious traditions, carried forward through colonialism. And in that kind of world, difference isn't just difference. It always gets cast as the opposite, the shadow, the failure to be the norm.
Okay, so autistic life gets read through that same lens. Like, persistence is seen as just being stubborn or willful. Repetition is obsession. Sticking to your own way of communicating is disobedience.
Precisely. That's the argument. Think about ABA again. The source suggests viewing it as another version of this, a theology of correction, where the child has to be bent to the will of the system, the therapist, the parent. That phrase, bring them to heal.
Yeah.
The source points out the historical echoes there, how women, children, colonized people were trained to submit. So what gets labeled disorder is maybe, in truth, just another order, a different way of knowing, a different epistemology.
Right. Analytic language builds brick by brick. Gestalt holds it whole.
Holds it whole, alive, embodied. But the system, biased towards the analytic, sees chaos where there's actually pattern, sees willfulness where there's fidelity. Calling it disorder, the source argues, says more about the namer's bias, like calling indigenous languages broken English or matrilineal societies primitive.
So autistic ways of being aren't lesser, just
Great
other.
other, that's the core message.
Which brings us right back around to why self-definition isn't just nice to have, it's presented as a necessity. If education is power, it needs reclaiming from domestication. If safety is a privilege now, it has to become a collective right.
Indeed. The source argues autistic scholarship, especially from GLPs, isn't a luxury item, it's fundamental. Without it, the world just keeps hearing Simon Says. And there are historical parallels, you know. Think about the original meaning of woke in the Black community. It was about self-knowledge, grounding yourself against a world designed to erase you, survival, rootedness in memory, resisting lies.
Like Black Power too. Education, safety, self-definition all tied together.
Exactly, and fiercely opposed by the status quo. The source suggests that for autistic people, the Kanner and Baron-Cohen deficit stories are the state-sanctioned narratives. They're palatable to power, but hostile to autistic truth. So being woke in that original deep sense, knowing ourselves, means resisting that, claiming our gestalts as memory, our echolalia as authorship, our voices as continuity. It means writing our own scripts, circulating them, so when the world shouts, Simon Says, we have our own truth to return to, our definitions, our maps, our memory intact.
Okay, so how do we actually do that? How do we build this counter-canon? The source mentions grounding it in critical and anti-colonial frameworks. What does that look like?
Right, the source is clear. Deficit framing isn't neutral, it's ideological. Kanner's inability, Baron-Cohen's male brain, the DSM checklist, there's stories told from power, masked as science. Critical frameworks like critical theory, the power threat meaning framework, PTMF, anti-colonial, thought they helped strip off that mask.
The PTMF that shifts from what's wrong with you to what happened to you, right?
Exactly. And how did power operate here? What meanings did you make? Suddenly, GLP isn't a deficit. It's a patterned, purposeful response maybe to threat. Scripts are memory. Echolalia is survival. And drawing on thinkers like Du Bois, Fanon, Winter, Clark, Lord, Hooks, it connects the autistic struggle for narrative sovereignty to this longer lineage fighting erasure and colonial power.
That makes sense.
There's a real irony. The source notes when people dismiss things like critical autism studies, Black studies, gender studies as not real scholarship. I mean, what is standard philosophy 101 if not implicitly white thought studies? The pushback isn't really about rigor, it's about whose knowledge gets counted.
Whose voice gets authority.
Precisely. So for many, using these frameworks isn't academic fashion, it's survival. It's how you avoid getting stuck in Simon's amber, as the source calls it. It's about placing autistic scholarship in that lineage of refusal to be erased.
So what does this mean for you listening? It sounds like narrative sovereignty isn't just a cool concept, it's a call to action, a practice.
Yeah, a key point here is that we absolutely can build authority outside the old gates. I learned this myself. Published is published, even if it's online, not in some fancy journal. We can create our own canon. So the call to action is pretty simple, but stubborn, as the source puts it. Write. Just write. Cite autistic scholars. Amplify each other's work. Footnote the living people doing this work now. Build bibliographies that lift autistic and GLP voices. Submit to journals if it helps you, sure. But publish on your own platforms when it doesn't. Teach from our sources. Use them. Litigate with them if you have to.
This is how we dismantle Simon Says, not by trying to get into his museum, but by building our own living library. One that actually hears us, values our different order as knowledge, makes it impossible to pretend we weren't here.
Which leaves a final question for you, the listener, to maybe sit with after this deep dive. What knowledge, what way of being unique to you, what perspective are you holding on to that the dominant story has tried to dismiss or erase? How can you start reclaiming its definition, asserting its value, and adding your voice to a richer, more authentic understanding of our world?